we are so grateful for Eileen Fisher hosting us tonight. With that, welcome to TCU's Discovering Global Citizenship panel on understanding sex trafficking, global, domestic, and local perspectives, hosted by wonderful Eileen Fisher. Tonight's esteemed panel consists of Ravi Kant, over there, who alongside his two brothers, Nishi and Rishi Kant, founded Shakti Vahini in 2001, an organization dedicated to achieving justice for women and children in India. Kant was the president of the National Network for Lawyers for Rights and Justice from 2002 to 2010, and in 2013 was honored with the Solidarity Award by Vice President Joe Biden for his work combating sex trafficking and gender-based violence. Welcome. He just got in on Saturday, so I hope you're welcome. Yeah. Dr. Vanessa Boucher is an assistant professor of political science at TCU. She was once my professor. She's the principal investigator of humantraffickingdata.org, a Department of Justice-funded open access searchable database of federal human trafficking cases in the U.S. Boucher has published a number of articles and reports on human trafficking and has served as an expert on human trafficking at working groups and conferences domestically and globally. Welcome. Senator Wendy Davis, who we'll recognize, served in the Texas Senate from 2009 to 2015 prior to running for Texas governor. In the Texas Senate, she championed legislation to combat sex trafficking and has been a strong leader and advocate regarding issues of gender-based violence and discrimination. She recently founded Deeds Not Words to continue to promote women's issues and train the next generation of women advocates. Welcome. And Rebecca Charleston, welcome, is a sex trafficking survivor from Fort Worth. She is a nationally recognized survivor leader in the anti-human trafficking community and is a recipient of the Survivor Leader Award from Unlikely Heroes. Her story is one of hope and redemption, and Rebecca recently graduated summa cum laude from Texas Wesleyan University and is now pursuing a dual master's degree at University of Texas at Arlington. My name is Ethan Murray. I am a recent graduate from TCU, as she mentioned. I spent the last 9 months as a Fulbright-Nehru Scholar in Delhi, where Ravi's stationed, based out of. And I worked under Dr. Vanessa Boucher on the humantraffickingdata.org and was a founding member with Madeline Carter of IJM's, TCU's IJM chapter. I recently, 2 years ago, was an op-ed contributor to Dallas Morning News on the connection between pornography and sex trafficking. With that, I would like to just jump in, if that's all right with everyone. Cool. So, Mr. Kant, to begin, would you briefly outline the sex trafficking industry in India, because the audience might not be so familiar, and Shakti Vahini's role within the anti-human trafficking movement?
Okay, so thank you for giving this opportunity. And the sex trafficking, I'll not call it industry, I'll call it exploitation, the sex trafficking exploitation. It involves a lot of young children and women from different parts of the country, and also there is cross-border trafficking from Nepal and Bangladesh. It's an organized crime. It is in many big cities, it's present there as brothels. Now with the advent of internet and technology, it's also increasingly going into websites through different channels and forums. So it's increasingly, it's increasing its presence, and since there is a demand, there is always be a supply, and they run through an organized crime. Someone identifies the child, someone brings the child, someone exploits the child, someone sells the child. There will be, since trafficking, they say, is one of the most money-spinning business after arms and drugs trade, and that is similar so in India also. And therefore, it generates a lot of profit, and the traffickers are very strong in terms because they have money power, when they have money power, and when there is money power, there will always be collusion with law enforcement also, and that creates a lot of very hard situations for victims to get rescued. One of the work we do is in this work is that we work with local law enforcement agencies across the country. We are training and sensitizing them. We are doing a lot of work with them, and also since we work a lot with law enforcement, we get a lot of requests for rescues and to find out missing children. India recently in 2016 has reported 20,000 cases of human trafficking, and the number of missing children and missing girls in India is like 140,000 to 130,000 figures are being reported every year, and these children are continuing to remain missing. They are not run away, they are continue to remain missing, and that's an indication. And out of the missing children also, you'll find 90% of them are girls. So you know that where they are going, and that is a huge problem. And in this scenario, we have been working with the law enforcement agencies. We get information to do a lot of rescue operations. We work with law enforcement, and therefore we do the rescue operations. We have to counsel the victim after taking them out, get them medical attention. It's a lot of work. And after the preliminary work of rescues, we have to also ensure that the victim get a sense of justice. The victim, to get a sense of justice, their perpetrators need to be punished. And it's a long drawn process of legal proceedings which happen in the courts, and we are there to follow. So each and every rescue operations which we do, and we collaborate with law enforcement, we also ensure that the traffickers get punishments. And that is the hardest part of the work for us, to ensure that these traffickers get punished, because you are fighting against money power. You are fighting against an organized crime, and there will always be a backlash and threats which we have always faced.
Thank you. And perhaps you could give just an overview of how the trafficking patterns flow. So is it from, you mentioned Nepal, and
yes.
Do they go to the city centers of Delhi?
Yes, what happens is that, as I said, that about 80% of trafficking in India is from within the country itself. There are some parts of the country like Eastern India which are very impoverished, and there is a lot of poverty indicators are high there. So there is a lot of trafficking happening from Eastern India, of states of West Bengal, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh. These are the states from where high source trafficking zones are there. And apart from the states in India, we also have cross-border trafficking from Nepal and Bangladesh. We are also witnessing international trafficking from Russian countries to India, and also with the lot of these young girls are getting trafficked to Thailand and Malaysia from the northeastern part of the country. We also have trafficking of Nepalese girls through the Indian borders to Middle Eastern countries, and also witnessing trafficking of lot of these girls who are taken up from domestic maids for Middle Eastern country, and they end up into sex trafficking work in those places. So it's as I said, that it's an organized crime, and it's a money spinning business, and where there is money spinning, there will be a lot of
Very similar to US. And Ms. Charleston, do you think you could maybe provide an insight on the US as a survivor leader and someone that has a deep understanding of local human trafficking situation? How would you say Mr. Kant's testimony is similar or different to the situation locally in the US?
Sure. Well, the travesty is it's taking place everywhere in developed nations and less developed nations. And just like you pointed out, Mr. Kant, that when you have a demand, there's going to be a supply. And that's what we see definitely in America, in almost every city, definitely the large cities all across the United States. We have actually, what's been identified as more than 20 different models in America that Polaris actually has come out with now, and there's kind of these archetypes of what trafficking may look like in America. For my personal experience, what it looked like was this older guy coming alongside me that seemed like he was going to take care of me and he was going to be my boyfriend. And then one day that changed, and that's often what happens in America. Is it's a what we consider the Romeo type, or the guy that comes along you. And I'm glad that you mentioned all the missing children and the runaways, because that's a huge problem here in America. Or we have kids that are aging out of foster system or running away from foster system, and they're not being reported. And these kids are disappearing on the streets. So my trafficking, like you said, began in Fort Worth. I was actually the youngest of 6 kids from a family that's still together today and intact. My parents have been married more than 50 years. I was raised in church, but I was still susceptible after becoming a runaway at a young age, and then getting picked up by a trafficker, and thinking that he was going to take care of me and protect me and provide for me. And the first day, it was him pitching all of his dreams to me, and it sounded great, and it wasn't until the next day that I realized what his dreams were going to cost me in the form of my body. And I had no idea what to do. I was 17 years old by that time, and I was scared. I was here on Harry Hines Boulevard in the backseat of a car being told what I had to say. And I didn't know what to do. I thought if I ran, I would die. So I might as well just stay and try to figure out how to get out. And that turned into 10 years of my life. I was trafficked more than 10 years all across the country. I had multiple traffickers. I ran away from the first one after a couple months. It was a terrible situation. I was starved. I was only fed once a day out of the gas station. And I ran away from him into the arms of someone that was 20 years older than me from California that seemed amazing, and he groomed me for months. I had no idea that I was running into the arms of another trafficker. Really, in actuality, looking back, he was waiting until I turned 18, so it would be quite as heavy of a charge for him if he was caught. And I can say that I'm proud to say that I also there was multiple women in that situation, and in 2012, after I had been out, I was able to rescue one of the women with him for 25 years. So what sometimes we see in the media and the images that we see in the movies, we see that it's this problem out there. And I really want to shed light on that it's also a problem here with our children. You know, that it can happen to anyone. So.
Yeah, statistically speaking, you mentioned a large number of Indian children missing, and I remember in, I think 2015 estimate was around 30,000 kids in the state of Texas were missing as well. And on that point, Dr. Shea, you've done extensive research on human trafficking, including surveying and interviewing both survivors and convicted traffickers in jail in the U.S. And you have developed a database, which I can help out on, humantrafficking.org. It's open source searchable of all federally prosecuted human trafficking cases in the U.S. Which is something that has led to a lot of insight on the trafficking situation nationally. Can you talk more broadly about the sex trafficking in the United States based on what you found in your research?
Yeah, so as we've already heard, oftentimes sex trafficking and labor trafficking, but in this conversation we're talking specifically about sex trafficking, is talked about in terms of supply and demand. Obviously, it's an economic enterprise, and so as with any commodity, there's supply and there's demand. So break it down based on who is the supply, who are the distributors, which are the traffickers, and then who are those that are demanding it. So supply, I think it's important to recognize, you know, that supply of victims in this country is very diverse. As Rebecca has discussed, you know, you have middle class, white, relatively privileged upbringing victims at times, but you also see undocumented minors from Mexico or Honduras or any other Central American country who are trafficked here for the purpose of working in cantinas, say, and there was actually a federally prosecuted case in Fort Worth regarding Hispanic minors from Honduras who were undocumented and were being trafficked out of cantinas in Fort Worth. You also have African American victims. A recent survey that I did of over 300 survivors across the country showed that over 45% of them were African American. And then, of course, you have Asian victims as well, and oftentimes the Asian victims work in different capacities than, say, for example, the African American or the white victims or the Hispanic victims. They all work in different outlets. So Asian victims primarily are in the illicit massage businesses. Hispanic victims are, of course, also can be in illicit massage businesses, but also are in these cantinas and oftentimes brothels across the East Coast especially. And then you have white and African American victims that are usually doing some sort of escort service or online prostitution. And so you see these patterns of based on race based on country of origin and based on sort of the venue where they're being trafficked. There are certain patterns that you can discern when you look at the data across the entire country. Then moving to the distributors, which are the traffickers, I interviewed traffickers that were convicted and are now serving time in federal prison. And the interesting thing that I found about the traffickers, which I was not expecting to find, was that they also have push and pull factors that lead them to become traffickers. So we talk about the victimization of the women and the push and pull factors that create the vulnerabilities for them to become trafficked, but there's also push and pull factors that lead criminals to do criminal acts. And what I found was that the push factors were also things like lack of education, childhood abuse of various kinds, and then those pull factors became desire for kind of control and power. In other words, the push factors were what were making them feel powerless. And so in order to regain control, they started victimizing others to control others to gain power and esteem. And many quotes across these traffickers where they talked about wanting to feel important, wanting to have someone who relied on them to gain back that power and control. And that was a finding that I wasn't expecting to find, but I think something that speaks to the need for rehabilitation in our prison systems. When you look across the entire country of those convicted of sex trafficking, the average sentence is 7 years, and the average age of the trafficker is 34. So they're getting out really in the prime of their life, and they still have ample time and opportunity and networks in order to continue in this trade. And if we're spending those 7 years in prison where we're not doing anything to help them understand why this is wrong, then these are lost opportunities. And we are really creating a cycle and spinning our wheels as opposed to like stopping the problem at its root. And then, of course, there's the demand. And these are the people that are buying sex and creating the demand. And what I would say about the buyers is that there is absolutely no prototype for who is a buyer of sex. It spans race, socioeconomics, it spans everything that you can imagine. You know, a buyer there's no typical buyer. And so I think obviously there is difference when it comes to the price, right? So what I heard from the traffickers was that the price differential was oftentimes based on two things. The race of the victim, so white girls with blonde hair and blue eyes are much more pricey than African American girls and Hispanic girls. So that's the first difference, which let's think about this for a second. We're in the year 2017, and we are still putting price tags on human beings based on their race. That's disgusting. So that's number one, but number two, the price differential also comes in regarding the sex act that they're asking for. So obviously, for people in certain socioeconomic brackets are able to pay for certain types of victims, whereas others are not. But it really spans the gamut. You cannot say that's the kind of guy that would buy sex. It doesn't exist. So that's what I would say regarding sort of what the state of things is across the country.
You painted a large picture, a detailed picture of the trafficker and kind of what the demand is, like what people are looking for. Senator Davis, as a state senator in Texas, you sponsored legislation addressing the issue of sex trafficking. From a policy perspective, what are the areas of strength and weakness in Texas? And perhaps you can give us a picture of what ways Texas is leading or what we're missing.
Well, I think Texas has been, as it is in many regards, very strong on the penal side. And unfortunately, that penal side has addressed itself not just to traffickers and to buyers, but also, unfortunately, to the young women who are victimized. It's very interesting that there's a different approach taken to boys and girls who are victims of sexual abuse within a family setting or a relative or friend setting versus young girls and boys who become sex trafficked. Interestingly, there's a different policy response to that, as though somehow the person who is sex trafficked is a willing participant in what is happening to them. And even though most legislators would tell you they know that that's not the case, there's still a disconnect in the way that the response is driven and the protections that are put in place. Rebecca was talking about the fact that there are these countless numbers of young people who kind of get lost. And they get lost because of that particular policy response that's not looking at them in the same protective way that the policy response looks at young people who are sexually abused outside of the sex trafficking network. In Texas right now, you have certain protections as a victim if you are 18 years or younger. There are some attempts to bump that number up because it seems ridiculous and absurd that if you are 18 years old, somehow you're not going to be accorded any protection as though this is a voluntary act on your part. So that's one of the areas that we need to improve in. We've done a good job of bumping up the penalties, but without what Dr. Boucher talked about in terms of any kind of rehabilitation of the people who find themselves in the system as traffickers. We haven't done as strong a job of the penalization for the purchaser of sex services as we should. There's a bill actually pending right now in the legislature that Symphronia Thompson in the House filed, and it would increase penalties for the purchasers, but also force them to be registered as sex offenders, which I think is a very wise move in terms of making sure that there's some stigma that follows the purchaser. That there may be, some rehabilitation conversations that should be a part of that as well. There was a report that was put together by the Texas Tribune, which is a really good online news source, and I would encourage you to look at it. The Texas Tribune really got into the weeds on this issue and interviewed a number of survivors and looked at the way the system is currently responding in the state of Texas. And they found some very disturbing information about that in terms of the fact that we aren't giving resources as we should to caring for the survivor of sexual assault when they come back into the system. It may shock you to know that the vast majority of young people who find themselves trafficked, I think a lot of people in our state and elsewhere think of trafficking as bringing young boys or girls across the border for purposes of trafficking them. But the vast majority of people in our state who are being trafficked are citizens of our state. About 86% of them, national estimates are coming out in some way of having touched the child welfare or the foster care system. And so we know we have this huge problem with young people who are finding themselves in that system. We know that it is a real pathway to their victimization, and yet putting any resources toward making sure that we're helping on the prevention side of that is severely lacking. And then when we do find them and bring them back in, there are very little in the way of resources in terms of providing a safety network and therapeutic support and counseling, social support services wrapping around these young women and young men who find themselves trafficked. So I really would encourage you to look at the Texas Tribune. They did, I think it was like a 3-part report on this, and they were very pointed in terms of the resources that are lacking in terms of how we're responding to the victims and preventing trafficking in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's the way in which NGOs have stepped up in that area, like Traffic 911, which I believe some representatives are here, and the NET, shows that there's a void there if they're having to step up into that area. That's super interesting. Moving on, Mr. Kant, I understand Shakti Vahini has played a large role in arguing cases in front of the Indian Supreme Court and has contributed considerably to policy formation. You are now partnering with TCU to develop an open source database for India. Can you talk to us more about why you believe this type of data and its public accessibility is a key next step in addressing sex trafficking in India?
I think for such a huge problem which concerns women and children, it is very imperative to have certain data which is well tested. And the data which we are partnering with TCU in collecting is the data of the cases which have been tried in courts. And this data will be very helpful in terms of strongly advocating these issues with our government, because many a times there are certain barriers which are created because people may say that where are the data on these issues. So I think this is a very important initiative which is being taken, and I am very thankful to the TCU for undertaking this research. They have done it in the United States, and I think that it will be a great opportunity for us to have it in India, because data affects policies, and therefore if we can have the right data, we can strongly advocate on these issues with our government as well as our legislators. The second issue is that for having strong legislations or having strong support services for victims, having compensations for victims, having victim shelter homes, all of this, because trafficking is a complex problem. It is like children are getting trafficked, but the aftercare is a huge problem. It requires shelter homes, it requires support centers, it requires good prosecutors, it requires good legal aid, and therefore we in India also we are in the midst of having a comprehensive legislation on human trafficking which is going to cater to all these issues. But again, if we have the right imperative data, it will really help in advocating for strong legislations. Also, for researchers, for law enforcement, it is also good to know that if we can have this data, patterns of crime, which are the places from the crime is originating, who are the people who are doing it, what are the court responses, how is the criminal justice system responding to these issues, how is the prosecutors responding to the issues, are the police doing the right thing or not. These are very important issues when we have to talk about victim protection, and this data can be one of an indicator to talk about with various our law enforcement agencies as well as legislators and parliamentarians. They need to know these issues. And also, lastly, sometimes because there is a collusion of law enforcement, wherever there is organized crime, there will be a collusion of law enforcement. Such data will also lead to research into what are the shortcomings of investigations which have happened. If investigations are not done properly, if the source traffickers are not caught, it's not only that the trafficker who is running the brothel should be caught, but the persons who trafficked the child, the person who identified the child, the person who exploited the child, all of these need to be caught. And these data, study of these cases and data will lead to an opportunity to learn whether the law enforcement is doing the right work or not, which is very important, because we may talk about prevention, we may talk about all these things, but finally at the end of the day, a victim of trafficking, if she knows that my trafficker is walking scot-free, is a very bad thing for her, and she will have never the sense of justice. So therefore I think this is a great opportunity, and it's I'm thankful to TCU for giving us this opportunity, and we are going to partner with them on this issue and hope to have this data as soon as possible.
Mr. Kant just mentioned that Mr. Kant just mentioned that it would allow them to basically legislate more effectively if they knew where people are coming from and give them a better analytical look at what a trafficking situation looks like. And there seems to be consensus that empirical data is both absent in India but also nationally as well. Can you explain what efforts are being made to close this data void? And perhaps considering perpetrators utilize technology to support their illicit activities, are we keeping up?
Yeah, I would say that there have been many people that, including policymakers, that have decried and have been decrying for about a decade now the lack of empirical data on human trafficking. There's lots and lots of numbers that are floating around regarding how many people are trafficked globally, and those numbers vary significantly. I mean, by, like 50 million people, so that's a lot. And how many people are trafficked in the United States, and what percentage are this or that. So lots and lots of numbers floating around, and we don't know the extent to which these numbers are actually valid and reliable. And so what we have been trying to do as a group of scholars is really use rigorous empirical methods to get at much cleaner data and more accurate, reliable, valid data. The National Institute of Justice is part of the Department of Justice, and they have been funding some of these studies across the country. But many of the studies that have been done thus far have focused on very local problems. So for example, there was a recent study that came out from San Diego County in California, and it's an excellent study of specifically the problem of gangs in human trafficking in San Diego County. It's very, very localized research, which is absolutely imperative because the problem is different in different localities. But that's not as helpful, especially for federal legislators who want a more global or national, as it were, look across the country. And so one of the things that I've been working on are various studies that help us to understand the breadth of the problem and the complexity of the problem across the entire country, as opposed to the more localized approach. And obviously the local studies help us, those inform the broader conversation, but they don't help us create policy across the entire country necessarily. So that's what we're hoping to do with the database that we're collecting, the cases that we're collecting that have been prosecuted federally. We also have collected a body of cases that have been prosecuted at the state and local level as well, and we're working on ways of integrating those into the larger database. But when you look at the cases that we have, which close to 900 cases prosecuted between the years 2000 and 2015, you look at these cases, you really get to understand the complexity of this issue. We're dealing with things like visa and immigration fraud. We're dealing with very complex immigration issues. You get to examine the different types of visas that people are fraudulently coming into the country using. You get to learn about really creative ways that people are starting businesses to bring people into the country. For example, I think, Ethan, did you code the case about the fake university? So this one group of individuals created a fake university. They actually set up a fake university, and it was supposed to be a nursing school where they were going to be bringing in women from the Philippines to be nurses and take classes in nursing at the school, but really what they were doing was trafficking them in nursing homes. So there's such creative ways that we've had people come in using visas for being in martial arts contests in the United States, and then they get into the United States. Allegra's nodding her head, she coded those cases. They get into the United States and are then trafficked for labor or for sex, or there's the creative ploys that they use are outrageous, and you start to realize the complexity and the breadth of all of this stuff going on. So yes, the local studies are helpful, but developing a database where people can look at the breadth as well is what we're aiming for. The other thing also is the economic impact of the sex trafficking industry in the United States. And so one of the studies that I've done is looking at demand for illicit massage businesses, specifically in Houston. So this is a local study, but essentially what we did is we used a website called rubmaps.com. I don't advise that you go to that website, but on it, there are roughly 400 illicit massage businesses listed in Houston, Texas. 400 just in one city alone. And so what we did was we mapped those, and then we looked at a representative sample of 32 of those. We surveilled them to make sure they were still existing. Based on that surveillance, we realized that at any given time, maybe 20% of the 400 that are listed are either not in business any longer or are potentially legal massage businesses and for whatever reason made it onto roadmaps. So we discounted that. Then what we did was we set up cameras outside on public property of these massage businesses, and we collected surveillance data for 24 hours on a random day of the week. And then we coded for the number of people that have gone in a 24-hour period. From that, we were able to count customers and cross-reference it with the data on how much on average they pay in these establishments, and we got that data from rubapps.com. And we collected data on the neighborhood demographics, just from US Census data, and put all of this together. From that study, we actually came up with a very valid and reliable number on what the gross revenues are for all illicit massage businesses in Houston, Texas. And anyone want to guess? 103 million is the minimum. That's the absolute bare minimum number.
Is that a year?
Per year. Per year. 103 million gross revenue in just the illicit massage business alone. That's not talking about street prostitution. That's not talking about brothels. That's not talking about escort services. That's not dealing with internet prostitution, right? Like, there's all kinds of other aspects of the underground commercial sex economy. We're talking about one tiny sliver of it, and it's $103 million in gross revenue. And that is empirical research, right? And so we can go to city council, and the other thing to note about this is that over half of these establishments accept cash only. So there's no record of the transaction, and there's no taxes being paid on this money. And this is really important. The city is losing out on a lot of money. The other thing about this is that many of them are registering as businesses that they're not really. So these are sexually oriented businesses, but they're not registered as a sexually oriented business, so there's zoning violations involved as well. And so but this is the type of research that we need more of in order to be able to say to policymakers, look, this is the economic impact of this. What are you going to start doing about it? They are operating with complete impunity in broad daylight. Some of them 24 hours a day. Why is this happening? Why are we not doing anything? That's the kind of thing that you can bring empirical research to bear on to put pressure on the people that are the decision makers in all of our communities.
And not just pressure on the decision makers, but also the law enforcement agencies can benefit from knowing exactly where these, I mean, you mentioned the traffic cone, and knowing which people were going to what places. I mean, you can do that. The law enforcement agencies definitely can benefit from that information as well. Mm-hmm. And Ms. Charleston, as a survivor leader and an advocate, you have considerable experience working with law enforcement agencies to help them better understand the complexities of sex trafficking. How would you characterize current efforts to combat sex trafficking, and in your experience, has this data void that Mr. Kant and Dr. Boucher just mentioned hampered these efforts?
Sure. So a lot of what I do is work with law enforcement over the different points of interception that they have possibly with victims. And it was interesting to hear you say, Mr. Kant, that traffickers on average are getting 7 years. And part of my trafficking experience was I served time in federal prison because I was too scared to tell on my trafficker. So they started surveilling our home, and it was the Department of Treasury, actually, an IRS agent started surveilling our home in Denton, Texas, and going through our trash, and they built a case, and they didn't know what was going on. They had no training on human trafficking whatsoever. So they arrested me in Las Vegas, Nevada, and they thought that I was the youngest one in the organization and that I would be eager to tell, but unfortunately they treated me like a criminal, and all they did was threaten me. There was no victim-centered approach, no trauma-informed care. no getting all of us together in a room and saying, hey, if you all talk, you can put him away for life. Because what I knew as a fact was that he would get out in a year or two, and then he would hunt me down and kill me like he always told me he would. And so that's a huge piece, and I'm so glad that we have created lengthier sentences, and now with the federal statutes and everything, it makes it a little bit better, but it's still difficult working with law enforcement oftentimes because of their approach to victims. And so hopping over to Hawaii, for example, still state in the United States of America, and how it's written in their law is that the law enforcement is actually able to completely entrap a victim. They can fully, keep this PG as I can, they can have a sexual experience with someone that's working in prostitution and then turn around and arrest them and take their money from them. So that's the way their law is written, and it's very difficult, even in different states in America, working with law enforcement for those reasons. And in terms of buyer demographics, there are 11 CEASE networks across America, which stands for Cities Empowered Against Sexual Exploitation. Texas has 2 of those teams because there's so much trafficking taking place here. And what I always like to say is just think about any city that has money, and that's where trafficking is, right? There's going to be a high rate of trafficking there because that's where the buyers are. That's where all the businessmen with money have to spend there. So traffickers know that, and they solicit to those areas. So as a member of the CEASE team for North Texas, we just had some really interesting research come out of the 1/3 study, which is just on buyers, which is pretty fascinating. I would encourage you to look it up. But what we've gotten out of that is online tactics that we can employ. So to try to create, because you're right, there is no one type of buyer. But like, okay, what out of 1,000, what can we look at as common characteristics, and creating like Facebook campaigns against that demographic of people, which has been really fascinating to use, and like buyer disruption ads, which Traffic 911 is on that team as well, and they work with, and as well as the net. So I actually just got contracted with JRSA as well to do a research study looking at nationwide online indicators of a trafficking victim versus just an ad of prostitution that the girl may have placed herself. So looking at those indicators, we're going to have about 10 trafficking survivors, and we're going to have 10 pro-sex workers that are completely different camps to get a really broad overview of the entire country of what actually is an online trafficking indicator to hopefully help law enforcement with those cases. And I just actually would like to pause and give a huge shout out to Eileen Fisher and this organization, this company, for getting involved. Recently I was able to train 750 Delta Airline employees, and it's so neat to see big corporations getting involved in the fight against trafficking, because you all and everyone that uses their services, they come in contact with so many more people than we do, right? Like we come in contact with law enforcement, social workers, attorneys, and so I'm really excited to see the broader scale of people getting involved that reaches people that we would maybe never come in contact with. Because there's so many people in America that still think like, oh, that's like the movie Taken, right? Like they have no idea that it actually is happening here, So part of my work right now that I just started doing is with the National Criminal Justice Training Center based out of Wisconsin, and I will be traveling the country training for them in tribal casinos in areas that cannot afford the training, because unfortunately that's where we see the trafficking happen. Part of my experience when I was turned out on Harry Hines Boulevard, we would meet customers in the car, and then we would have them follow us to a little seedy motel right off Harry Hines Boulevard that would sell us rooms by the hour, and I would buy condoms at the front desk as a 17-year-old little girl. And I would go back out in the parking lot, and I would get another guy, and I would go to the front desk, and I would rent another room for an hour, even though it had only been 10 minutes. And those businesses were doing nothing to stop it. So creating legislation is such a huge part to those zoning violations, like how can we shut these businesses down or make them comply, make them become legal. So creating like a comprehensive plan for the state with the Texas Governor's Office and the NCJTC working to create a unified response when we do get a victim of sex trafficking, especially a minor victim of sex trafficking. And what's that response to her, so that we make sure that we reach her, so that she doesn't have to turn back around 7 times, which is the average for a victim to go back to trafficking before they're finally able to make it free, because they're not getting those wraparound services. So law enforcement plays a crucial role, obviously, in being many times the first point of contact with the victim, and how they treat that victim can make or break their case as well as the victim's life. So.
You're definitely doing a wide range of kind of, you're studying, you're working with different agencies, and all coming together to kind of educate law enforcement agencies. Senator Davis, as a former legislator and strong leader in Texas, can you talk about why more and better data that all three of those panelists have mentioned is important for legislating in this policy area specifically, and from your perspective, what type of information is needed?
Well, I think everyone has talked about the need for empirical data and why it informs policymaking. Part of what's important about it is that it creates data so that lawmakers can no longer shield themselves by saying, we haven't really defined the problem. And I gotta tell you, lawmakers hide behind that. There are a lot of lawmakers that don't want to think about these complex problems and the way we solve them, particularly and primarily because it costs a lot of money to do it. So creating that data and creating the pressure point that the data provides is incredibly important. There was a report that was released just recently. It was housed at UT. Noel Bush Armendariz led this effort. I'm sure you all were a part of that as well. And they wanted to figure out from a statewide basis, what does this look like? Because we really didn't have those numbers, even though we knew it was bad. In 2015, a report indicated that Houston, Texas, was the #1 sex trafficking city in the entire country. So we know we have a huge problem here. But this mapping project revealed some really sobering information. Number one, that there are about 313,000 victims of sex or labor trafficking in our state. This does not include women or men who are 18 or older. This includes children up to the age of 18 and labor trafficking. But we don't have the sex trafficking number for 18 and up. So we know the number is even bigger, much bigger than that 313,000 number. 79,000 of that 313,000 are the children who we have data, very good empirical data that tells us this is the number of children who are being exploited. As I said earlier, a vast majority of them are coming out of some contact with our child welfare or our foster care system, both of which are dramatically and severely underfunded in this state. I cannot stress enough how severely underfunded they are. We also know the economic cost of this, and this is an important tool for helping to capture lawmakers' attention and to get them to do something about it. It's that cost-benefit analysis, right? We're asking you to spend some resources to solve a problem, and the reason that we're asking for it, if you have a heart of stone and you really don't care about it from a social impact status or perspective, at least care about it from the economic side. And on the economic side, we know that Texas, it's costing Texas about $6.6 billion in lost economic opportunities and in responses from the criminal justice system, and some of the other data that Dr. Boucher talked about all fold into that number, but it is a huge number. And clearly, it's the old Benjamin Franklin, penny-wise, pound-foolish problem that we're dealing with. I think there's a lot of work that we need to do on the prevention side. We, through Deeds Not Words, which is my nonprofit organization, have been doing trainings in high schools. And while you may think this is scary for young high schoolers to learn about and a topic that's very challenging to talk about, and it is, It's so important, and it is actually empowering. The young women primarily, and some young men who have gone through these trainings, there are 3 high schools in Dallas that have done this, and a high school in Austin that have done this. They have benefited so tremendously in learning about what the warning signs are, what grooming is, how and why they can be vulnerable to a trafficker, how to be an active bystander if they see this happening with a friend, how to report, what are the warning signs to look for. And what's remarkable about these young people is that they've been so empowered by this information, they began to ask this beautiful, important question: why are we the exception, not the norm? Why are only these few disparate schools getting this information and this training? And so they actually were the spearhead behind legislation that Senator Judah Zaffirini filed. It's going to be heard in the Senate Education Committee, hopefully next week or the following week. And it seeks to take this prevention program and make it a statewide program so that it's something that we're doing in all of our high schools. And eventually, we really need to be doing it in our middle schools as well. But those are some of the things that we're continuing to work on and that I think are a really important part of helping to get at these numbers and to whittle them down. One of the important recommendations that came out of this report is that we need to be doing so much more on the prevention side. And then finally, I want to highlight something that you said, Rebecca, about making sure that we're providing this training to people who have the capacity to see this happening and have an opportunity as active bystanders to step in. In our weekly newsletter that we do at Deeds Not Words, we highlight a change maker, someone who has done something to be recognized for, and recently we highlighted a flight attendant who had gone through this training literally like the week before, and who recognized a young woman on her flight who was showing some of the signs that she was trained to look for, and she rescued this young woman from child trafficking, and the person who was trafficking her is being prosecuted right now. So it gives me chills just thinking about it, but it really is powerful, and it's something for all of us to keep in mind in terms of the pressure points that we want to put on legislators and the things that we're asking them to support.
I think both of your testimonies highlight the importance of training. You trained Delta Airlines flight attendants, so maybe perhaps that you might have trained them. But also the lack of training in the schools, and you highlight the lack of training in the hotel industry. And I know my home state, they have in my Orange County, they have a training program for hotel agencies. So why not have that in the state of Texas as well? That's super interesting area for us to grow, and that's fascinating. Both your testimonies align on that. I know that we are slightly running out of time, so I want to keep these last questions somewhat brief, so I can open it up to the audience for Q&A. I know you guys probably have exciting questions, much maybe better than mine. Mr. Kant, I still remember sitting in your office nearly 2 years ago now, and being somewhat distraught at the prospects of doing something. It's such a complex and unruly issue, which you highlighted throughout your testimony here tonight. You explained to me that we all have a torch to carry. Some, like you guys, this esteemed panel, larger than others. Could you give us some examples of how people whose torch has just been lit, hopefully some people in this audience, can grow their flame and contribute in more concrete ways?
Yeah, the problem is very huge, and therefore the first, in terms of when we talk about sex trafficking, we have to ensure that we don't become the demand. The number 2 issue is raise your voices. Reach out to your community. Talk to young people about these issues, because talking to young people will certainly lead to a lot of prevention. What they are doing at TCU, I think, is when young people and adolescent girls and young students are getting exposed to these issues, it multiplies the work of prevention. reach out to your community, have empathy for others, be sensitive to victims of trafficking, because that is very important. Their pains and their troubles which they go through, it's very important, and therefore we should be sensitive to these issues. And finally and lastly, that since we are fighting this organized crime, support this issue. You can support by raising your voice, and you can support it financially also, because it's a big industry which we are fighting. It's a big network of criminals and nexus which is there, and with the law enforcement not properly being with you, it becomes very difficult, and therefore you can support it also.
Thank you. And like you said, the inspiring youth, there's a lot of TCU students in this room that have all caught that flame, so to speak. Ms. Charleston, as the only survivor leader on this panel, you have the most intimate understanding of this issue because it was once your reality. Your testimony of courage and resilience, coupled with your academic expertise, gives you a unique voice of authority in addressing this issue. What is one thing you would like the people in attendance tonight to take away?
Hopefully not to be completely cliche, but I love this quote. I just found it. I toured the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. a couple weeks ago, and I took a big photo of Ida B. Wells' quote, which just really struck a chord with me. The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And I feel like you guys being here and actively participating, but it not stopping here, that you all go out and you educate your family and your friends and your community, because that's how change happens. I feel like change starts with everyone in this room. So, and I think educating others helps us to stop misidentifying the issue, and that way we can start helping once we really see the problem and get the scope of it.
And moving on, Ms. Davis, thank you so much for your leadership on issues of gender-based violence in the state of Texas and beyond. Your activism has shown you have big aspirations for the future of our state and our country. What investments are worthwhile towards promoting a cultural shift in America and ending human trafficking in the U.S.?
Well, first of all, Ethan, your questions were great. I'm very proud fellow Horn Frog. As I said a moment ago, the legislation that's pending right now to create a broader prevention program, education program in our Texas public schools is, I think, incredibly important. And I believe that it will really help young people who will understand warning signs and hopefully not fall prey to some of the traffickers. We do, though, really need to spend resources in two important ways beyond that. One of them is creating that sheltered experience and to change the mindset from criminalizing young women and young men who become caught up in the web of trafficking, and to embrace them with support services and a safety net that helps them to leave that system. Everyone has talked about how prevalent recurrence in the system is, and it's because there is no safety net, and a great deal of fear, unfortunately, and intimidation that pulls young women and men back into that. And then finally, I always think about things from the perspective of how we get lawmakers to do what we hope they will do. And I hope you are as encouraged as I am by where we find ourselves in this country right now. I know we're facing down some pretty dark times, but we're also looking at the highest level of engagement and voter connection to what their legislators are doing than I've seen in my 53-year lifetime, and I'm really encouraged by it. We tend to think about those big picture issues that are happening at the federal level, and I know a lot of people have weighed in on what's happening with the Affordable Care Act, for example, what's happening with the defunding of Planned Parenthood, for example, but I would encourage you, please, to look closer to home at what's happening in your own state. and to do some research about that. Read these Texas Tribune articles as a starting place and find out who your state rep and your state senator is and make that phone call to their office and tell them what it is that you expect as a constituent of their district in terms of what their responses are going to be. And particularly what their support is going to look like for the child welfare and foster care system in this state. An estimate at the beginning of this session revealed that we are underfunding it by over $1 billion. And in the budgeting, there was a creation of about $300,000, which, I mean $300 million, which sounds like a lot, but it is nowhere near what is needed in order to really make sure that when children are entering this system, they are surrounded by support and care, and they don't find themselves. Remember, over 80% of the young people who are trafficked have touched that system in some way, and that system had an opportunity to save them from this, and it didn't. So please press on your legislators to do something about that.
Speaking of like being close to home, Dr. Shea, you wear many hats. You are a teacher, educator, leader. As someone tasked with educating and empowering the future generations of leaders, how have you seen this work impact students, and what is the best way to continue to equip and educate the public about this issue?
On the inside of your programs, on the left-hand side, there are quotes from students who have taken my human trafficking class at TCU on human trafficking in the United States, quotes from students who did the India study abroad, and quotes from students who have been a research assistant with me on humantraffickingdata.org. And I think just from those quotes alone, you can tell the impact that it's had. So it's had considerable personal impact on their future trajectories in their life. For example, Madeline Carter, sitting in the front here, is going to law school next year, and she's going to be a human trafficking she wants to prosecute human trafficking cases in the U.S. Ethan, for example, he's also going to law school. You notice a theme among political science students, but he may not end up being a human trafficking prosecutor in the future, but one thing that he did do is, on his own, wrote an article that was published, an op-ed that was published in the Dallas Morning News about the intersection of pornography and sex trafficking, and educating the public based on the information that he's gained both as a student in these classes as well as doing research on this. And so he will be a voice, a male voice, which I think is absolutely critical on this issue going forward. And so, what people think oftentimes is that when professors do research, it's kind of taking away from their teaching. But what I've found is that my research and engaging students in the research has actually been a form of teaching in of itself. It is a form of experiential learning unto itself. And so I would just, say that, echoing what Senator Davis said about the importance of education, I have testimonies of students, and these are TCU students, and people think of TCU students and they think privileged, right? That's the sort of the adjective that comes to mind. And so I have students sitting in my classroom, and this year I had one student email me and say that she realized that her sister is being trafficked. And for the longest time, they thought that her sister was just crazy and had a really old man as a boyfriend. But it turns out that he was her pimp. And she said that, she did not realize this until she took the class, and now she's able to look at the situation in a completely different way. I had another student who was in Las Vegas for spring break, or for fall break, and said that she was approached by a Russian girl who was sitting by a Russian man, and came over and said, "My boyfriend thinks that you're really pretty, and he's a modeling agent and wants to talk to you about modeling," which is a very typical ploy. She said, "Honestly, if I wasn't in this class, I don't know that I wouldn't have gone to talk to them." but knowing what I've learned in this class, I was like, wow, this is actually happening to me. And there have just been story after story of my students' eyes being opened, even in their own lives, about how pervasive this is. And so the importance of education, and I'm talking about college students, this would be much more impactful starting at a much younger age. And so just echoing the importance of starting at a young age and educating people about these issues is absolutely imperative. One of my former students, Brian Toney, is over here, and he works on education policy here in Dallas with Dallas ISD, and I think also can speak to just the importance of education at a young age and inculcating people with this knowledge young. So there's lots and lots to be done and lots of ways to educate the public, and I think that, you know, the research that we create also is a form of dissemination to the public, of making this publicly available, and so people can access it and see how complex, how diverse, how pervasive the issue is.
Thank you. And thank you all for your wisdom, courage, and willingness to challenge conditionalism. Your leadership is inspirational. With that, I mean, I know we got a late start, so